We think the overall aim of a government is to make its citizens happy. That's why we allow the stunning of development of severely mentally ill children. Mentally ill, defined in this regard, is a little bit difficult for us because, yeah, we are not in that, from that field, but we would say so roughly the mental capabilities of a 6-year-old. So everything that is around that, I think we can have a medical board that is deciding that. We cannot say for sure where this line is to be drawn, but this is somewhat the idea. So, what are we presenting to you? Firstly, we are presenting to you why it is actually better for the parents. I think that's a pretty reasonable case. After that, I will present to you why it might be better for the children as well. Even though we cannot always tell for sure if it will be better, we at least want to make this plausible. And after that, I want to talk about analogies where we are doing this as well in the society to take care of people and to take care of people that way that we are restricting their freedoms and that rights are just a means to an end, which is to make people happy. So let's start with the idea: why does it make parents happen? Firstly, they are choosing to do it. They are not forcing to do it. They are not forced to do it. So there is a reasonable probability that it is good for them. Otherwise, they would probably choose differently if they are fully informed of what happened. It is not always. There might be a certain uncertainty, but we are pretty sure that parents will take that into account. So, secondly, it will be easier to handle those children. So, in Germany, you are obliged to do civil service, which basically means that you have to take care of other people for a certain amount of time. I did this for 9 months, which means as well that you have to take care of those children who are mentally in the age of a 6-year-old, but are at the stage of a 20-year-old, which means that they sometimes get overly aggressive over nothing. This is okay if it is a 6-year-old, but it is really a problem if it's a grown man who is 25 years old but don't know what to do with his force and with his power. This is extremely problematic for the parents to deal with this. All those problems arise as well when it comes to handle simple things. For example, strong forms of autism where you start to beat yourself. This is okay to handle with as one person, as parents, when it is a 6-year-old that is not that strong. But if it is a 25-year-old grown man, it's incredibly hard to do that. Why is it important then, and this is my next point, that the parents do this and not someone else? So someone from outside might do this as well. We could maybe take 4 people that actually help these children. But it is important to have a fixed point for these children. If the world is overly complicated for you, and if you can grasp the whole world as a total, and everything is overwhelming you, then it is important that you have one fixed point, and this might be your parents. If your parents are a little bit more happy and it is easier for them and not stressed all the time, it might seem a simple thing not to be stressed. But if you have a child with such a disability, it is hard to not be stressed all the time, and to not get angry, to still unconditionally love this person. Let's make it a little bit easier for them. And this fixed point helps the child to actually identify the world, to crystallize the world from its own perspective. Before that.
So I think that there are many other ways often to deal with the issues of a post-pubescent person with mental disability through various treatment, various programs, other medical options. Given there are less restrictive ways of doing this, why should we prioritize the perfect ease of the parents over the well-being of the child?
Yeah, firstly, you have to prove me that the well-being of the child is actually harmed with that. Secondly, the idea that there are treatments, I think we would mostly apply this to genetic disabilities, so there's a chance or high chance of treatment of this, and this will be a perfectly fine child. Probably we would not apply this in this case because it's just not a good idea. So we don't do stupid policies. I think that's what opening up wants to say. The idea in that regard is that we believe that there are other options, and we are willing to use this as well. If they are mutually exclusive, I like to see them, and we are willing to see this in a second POI maybe, that I might take later. But if they are mutually exclusive, we still think that if the world is overly complicated for you and you have a fixed point as a parent who is less stressed, this will make you happier. The next point why it might make children happier is the idea that even for us, we are mentally without mental illness, going to the change and the process of your body changing, your strength changing, your desires changing, all those things is incredibly difficult. If you're a teenager, I was a horrible teenager, and I'm pretty sure most of you were as well, I'm pretty sure that this is hard to deal with. Those are problems that are for us complicated. If you have the capabilities of a 6-year-old, this is not just complicated, this is destroying your world, because this complexification is not just happening in your surrounding, it is happening in yourself. And you cannot deal with it adequately because you don't have the capabilities. We think we make the world for this child a little easier. Maybe it's not such a bad thing if you don't have the capabilities to live in a complex world to make the world easier for you. That's why we think it might be better. Yeah, go ahead.
how likely are you to be taken seriously in the world in a way that lets you get a job or meaningfully access so many parts of the human experience that people view you as a child?
Because you are a child, you are mentally a child. That's why you can be regarded as a child, which is not problematic if you are a child. So we are saying that for those cases we are talking about, these people are children. They are mentally children. Therefore, we think it is okay to regard them as children and treat them as children. You can say that it is harming your self-actualization. This is just a problem if you have the very concept of self-actualization being harmed because of external factors of social norms that you probably don't know at the age of 6. If you have never experienced another world, if you could not grasp another world that is telling you you are missing something out, then you can still have a happy life as a 6-year-old where we think that we are totally fine with it. So, now my analogies part. The analogies part is basically we are restricting times for mentally ill people all the time to take better care of them. We are doing this for old people as well. We are locking them down. We are fixating them to the bed to better take care of them and so that they cannot hurt themselves. This is the same case here. If you are really strong, it is way easier to hurt yourself. The idea that the people cannot take care of you and that you can harm other people more easily is a severe one if you cannot grasp the consequences of your actions, which is usually the case of a child, that it has not the same idea of consequences of actions. And this is very problematic if you are strong, if you have strong sexual desires, you see a woman and you want to, you know what I mean? You want to sleep with her, but you don't know the social concepts of rape. You cannot understand it. You have the strong desire, but you're simply doing it because you could never grasp this. All those things are ideas where you can limit the freedom to save other people and those people and the children as well. With Alzheimer's patients, you are constantly doing that. We are helping them by actually taking care of them, but restricting their freedom as well. We see here that it is a strong case that we are making, and it is harsh to interfere in that life. But we think if we can make the life of those children easier by making their world less complicated, making the life of the parents easier because the children they have to take care of have less force, have less possibilities to hurt other people, the surroundings, the parents, and themselves. This will make them more relaxed, more calm, and this has the thing disabled children need most. An environment that's actually helpful and supporting it. Thank you.
I thank the member for his address, and I invite the leader of the opposition forward to open up the off-lecture here.
Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister tells us that these people are already children in their minds, so they might as well be children in their bodies too. But here's the thing. Being a child means two different things. It means to have a body that is not capable of a whole lot of things, and it means to have a mind that is not capable of a whole lot of things. We think there are two philosophies for how you should deal with the differently able. Either you can infantilize them and just try to make them as little a problem as possible, or you can try to make them as normal as possible, allow them to lead normal lives that allow them to be satisfied. We definitely favor the latter approach to things. I don't think we heard a particularly compelling case for why it's okay for parents to decide in these circumstances that just because it's more convenient for them, just because they have a misguided suspicion that it might make their children's lives better, they should be able to engage in this incredibly invasive procedure. So I want to bring you 3 points of construction for Op's case. I want to talk about the duty of the state, I want to talk about the many harms to the children we think this will cause, and I want to talk about the larger political consequences of this policy. But before that, 4 points of rebuttal. So first, we get this idea out of the Prime Minister that parents will always choose what's best for their children because, like, it's a case of choice, and why wouldn't you choose what's best for your children? I think he gives us the reasons for that later in his speech, though, right? Like, there are a whole number of ways in which having one of these children can be incredibly disruptive to your life. It can take up more of your time, interfere with your ability to do your job. It can just make you very frustrated because you're constantly dealing with someone who you have a very difficult time explaining things to, but who is capable of doing things that are very disruptive, right? Like, there are all sorts of other reasons besides the child's well-being that might cause a parent to decide that they want this. The second thing he talks about is the specific case of people who are dangerous to themselves. So I think he means like people who have like severe cases of cerebral palsy, things like that, right? So I think that there are other less invasive treatments we can use to deal with people in these circumstances, right? Like, for example, people who have cerebral palsy often have chairs that allow them to like have some degree of mobility, but some restraint to the point where they can't hurt themselves. I'm not talking about you. Or there are things like Botox treatments that allow you to relax the specific muscles that cause them to hurt themselves, but don't require you to totally disrupt their physical structure. So I think there are other better ways to deal with this. The third thing he tells us is that your life is just overly complicated if you don't do this. I just don't really understand this, right? Like, it's the case that you have a 6-year-old's perception of the world, but 6-year-olds are capable of enjoying living in the world and doing very complex things with their bodies in the world, right? Like 6-year-olds can be pretty decent soccer players or runners. They can play outside. They can interact with space. They can climb trees. They can do all these things. I just don't think we should just assume that this is the meaningful tipping point in terms of them being horribly confused. And then the final thing he talks about is this idea of rape, this idea that there's danger to other people. So I just don't think it's okay to preempt the fact that someone might later pose a threat to other people in society. And just fundamentally disrupt their bodies. If we found some piece of genetic code that increased your chance of being someone who committed acts of sexual violence by 50%, I don't think that would be a facial reason to chemically castrate that person at that point. I don't think that's a way to construct a just society. So I want to get to our arguments. So the first thing I want to talk about is the duty of the state in this case. Because we do concede, right, that there is some role for parents to play in deciding what's best for their children. But we think that what follows from that is, in this case, at the point where the state doesn't allow this procedure, the state should provide other things, like caregiver assistance, like the resources people need, like the sorts of chairs or Botox treatments that I talked about a minute ago. But the reason that we think at the end of the day they need to protect children is pretty simple. Parents consent to the risk of having a child with one of these issues to some extent. I'll take you in a minute. They don't consent completely, right? They don't know exactly what the condition might be. But people who go to have a child are aware that there's some possibility that their child will be born with some sort of disability. But the children we're talking about in this case have no agency whatsoever. And we think it always ought to be the role of the state to protect the less agency-bearing person when there are different claims about the harms and benefits to people. Go ahead, Nick.
So Botox is a muscle relaxant. It doesn't make your mind work better. Can you give me some specific treatments that you believe would be effective?
No, the Botox example was a response to their argument about people who muscle spasm that cause them to hurt themselves, right? You don't need to cripple them in order to prevent them from hurting themselves. I don't think my duty in this round is to explain how we're going to solve mental illness. That was a very strange piece of burden analysis. All right, two further reasons. So the first thing I want to talk about is the harms to children, and Mike already got at this with API. So the first problem, I think, is one of dehumanization. Recognizing that what we're dealing with here are people who are actually adults, who actually have a lot of experience, and while they may be mentally handicapped in certain areas, have an adult degree of experience in certain other areas. But they feel as though they are different already, and we're increasing that, we're compounding that, and treating them like their children. I think, first of all, this is a problem because it leads to a psychological harm. Right? We're not talking about people who are brain dead in this case. We're talking about people who do have lives, do have experience, and do have a collection of knowledge in certain areas that's equivalent to those that an adult could call on. And we think it's not very pleasant to be one of these people, but always be treated exactly like a child because you look like a child and talk like a child, and in certain areas of your behavior, you seem like a child. Also recognize that they can't actually do adult things, right? Like there are things that adults can do because they have bodies that have more muscle tone, right? For example, if you're 6 years old, it's very difficult to play basketball. It's very difficult for you to make this motion. But if you're 20, you can do that. Lots of 6-year-olds would love to play basketball, see, for example, the fact that they love playing other sports. So I think that's a problem. But the final harm under this dehumanization point has to do with societal harms. And I think this is probably the most important one, right? Because recognize that just because you're mentally disabled doesn't mean you're never going to be able to have a job. You're never going to be able to have interactions with people outside your family. But at the point where everyone always assumes you're a child on site, it's much, much more difficult for that sort of thing to ever happen. There are not very many companies around that are particularly interested in hiring 6-year-olds. Because first of all, it's probably likely to make your customers very confused about the fact that you have a 6-year-old working in your kitchen or whatever. At the point where these people do want to have meaningful lives and can't have them through work, we think there's a problem. But I also think there's a problem in terms of activity, right? Recognize that these people are already mentally handicapped, which means that if they are going to have fulfilling lives of the sort I just talked about, it's going to be through their bodies, right? At the point where you have very limited mental capacity, it's much more likely that the thing that will give you the most meaning or pleasure in your life is a physical thing, some sort of sport, some sort of simple task that you can do with your body. So I think that you're actually hurting these people far more on their side of the house for that reason. But the other thing I want to talk about is political consequences. So recognize that the rich are much more likely to be able to access this procedure. First of all, it's optional, so it's quite likely that a lot of insurance companies and a lot of state healthcare providers are not going to pay for it. Second, they have more financial resources. They're more likely to have information about it. And there are probably a limited number of doctors who are willing to do this sort of thing. and they're more likely to have access to that. So what's going to happen on their side of the house is these people are going to be much less likely to lobby for the sorts of care that we want the state to provide, supplemental care rather than care that actually fundamentally changes the nature of the lived experiences of these children. We think that's a problem because we think that's the better kind of care to have. And that's the kind of care that poor people will be able to access, and they won't be able to access these treatments. We oppose.
I think the member for his address, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister forward.
Madam Speaker, basically I have 2 points for you. My first point, it's going to be a mixture of rebuttal and clarification in pointing out to you that the thing that we're doing here and the people that we're talking about are not the people that opposition is talking about. They don't have these capabilities, they don't have this potential to grow up and be in the position where they could even potentially get a job because they are so limited in their mental capacities, that it also plays into their bodily capacities, and they are maybe physically looking like a grown-up person, but the mental state that they are in is that of a child, and it's not, so we're not doing, we're not preventing potential citizens of growing up and having meaningful lives, even with disability. It's something completely different. And second of all, I'm going to talk about why we think the state should trust the parents and should give this right to the parents. We think that that is something that is already there in the status quo, that we trust parents to make very, very difficult, even life and death decisions when it comes to their children, and we think there's a good reason for that and why we should even extend it in this case as well. So let's talk about, first of all, the clarification and the misunderstanding here from First Government. The thing that we tell you is that the kids that we talk about and the illnesses we talk about, they're illnesses where we definitely know that there is no remedy. We know that, from the experience we have with this illness, if you are born with that, or if you have an accident and you happen to have that disease, we know that you cannot, there is no cure and there is no development, and we know that until you die, and most of the time these people die early deaths, like 30 or 40 years, they don't get to get 60 or 70, you will have a certain mental disability, and that is being at the stage of probably a 6-year-old, a very small child. So we know that the ability and the mental capacity of these people, these children, will never evolve, so that they never get to the point where they potentially can develop and enter all those various stages mentally, and in self-understanding, memory, self-controlization, and self-understanding of themselves as a personality that, like everyone else, goes through when you grow up, when you start understanding things, you have memories, you have concepts, you have ideas about the future. These are things that these children, because they are mentally disabled, because they have that, they cannot ever get into that position. So that's why we're not limiting citizens of becoming full citizens, or even to a limited extent, if you compare it to people that are healthy, we're not doing any harm to anyone, we're not taking away anything from them, because they don't even have that potential. So when we find ourselves in that situation, and we see all the problems that my partner talked about that occur when you have a person that has that mental stage of a 6-year-old, for instance, but has the body of a grown-up, and all the things that physically and biologically happen with you when you actually grow up, and the way you change in certain degrees with your body developing to become a full grown-up person, we're faced with the question, is there a way to actually deal with that without harming the person, but making the taking care of that person easier and even better for the person itself? And we think that is something we're doing when we give the parents the right to do that, so they can better take care of this child. Before I go on, your question, please.
If this is strictly beneficial for both the children and the parents, would you require the parents to do this for their children?
We would not require it, because we think at the core of this thing here are the parents and how much they think they're capable of taking care of that. Not only in themselves feeling the mental strength to be able to deal with all the problems and the difficulties that they might face, but also with the monetary things that come with the difference between having to take care of a disabled child and having to take care of a disabled grown-up for an entire life. Because you have to actually acknowledge that the parents are going to be the custodians of these children for the entire life of those children, because the severity of mental disability that we talk about means that these people will never get to a point where the state, these children will never get to a point where the state grants them the ability to take care of themselves, to be actually like of age, and even if they would get 18 years old, they would still have to have a, they would still have to have a custodian. And in most cases, it would be their parents, because these are the ones that started being their custodians, and it would most of the time remain with them because it always remains with the relatives. And we think that is something that is going to happen anyway. But we can actually make it easier for both parties that are involved in this situation to have a better life. I think we should do it, because we think, what happens otherwise? If you, for instance, as a parent, are faced with such a child, and there are even some countries where when you're allowed to do abortion, one reason that is seen as legitimate by the government is, for instance, if you have a child, or you're about to have a child that has a severe disease, and it's already, you can already see that in the first couple of weeks, that the state acknowledges that this psychological burden on parents is a legitimate reason for them to abort a child, because they recognize that it is more difficult. It's not a statement that this type of life is not valid or should be aborted or something like that. It's just acknowledging the reality of parents and people in this society and what it actually means to have a child that has a certain degree of a disability. And this is why we say, if you make it easier for parents to take care of their child, if you make it more likely for them to actually keep that child and not really give it up to adoption or never even have that child, we think we're making the life of the child better, because it can stay with the same parents, it can stay with the same persons of reference that take care of it for its entire life, that they are a caring person that they have a reference to, and are not given away or something like that. Closing, please.
Watching other people who are your age and now have physical capacities that you don't have is likely to cause a lot more suffering for these individuals. So could you please explain why it doesn't make self-harm and other types of problematic behavior actually more likely?
I don't know how much more explicit I'm supposed to do this, because I'm going to do it again for you to hopefully make this clear. The illnesses and degrees of disability, as stated in the motion severely, are ones that we say, we talk about is where your mental development possibility or probability is just, you're never going to reach beyond that of a 6-year-old or a very small child. So in order to be able to suffer all these damages you just pointed out, you need to be able to develop mentally into a certain position where you can actually understand those things, so you can have an understanding of the others and myself, and in reference to them and in regard to them, how I am actually doing and how they're doing, how old they are, how old I am. All these things that are not possible for a very small child, and there are a stage in which these children will actually be forever because they are disabled. And in addition to that, we think we're making it easier for the parents. Now lastly, this idea about the state. The state is already giving a lot of trust to the parents, because we think they're the ones that carry the burden and the responsibility and have the biggest amount of love and care for this child, and will always act in doing the best thing. This is a very difficult decision, and we think it should be given to parents if they think it makes it better and easier for them to give their child a better life. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for her address, and I invite the deputy leader of the opposition board to close out the front half. Here.
Great, so I'm going to add some new material on the idea of parents and some new material on the idea of society, but I want to talk about four things in the speech. The first thing I want to talk about is the question of who matters at the end of the day. What parties should be prioritized if interests are competing here? Why we should prioritize them this way? There are three stakeholders in this debate. There are parents, there are children, and there are the rest of society. How do those things get prioritized? We think parents are at the bottom of the priority scale. Why? 3 reasons. First, parents consent to the risk meaningfully by choosing to have a child. Let's be reasonable here. We recognize that there is no understanding and there's low probability, and a kind of thing that you can't fully internalize maybe at the time. But comparatively to all of the other actors involved in this debate, the children themselves, and compared to the rest of society who is negatively affected by this, parents consent the most to those impacts. But second of all, children should be prioritized above parents with certainty, because they have no capacity to advocate for their own interests in any meaningful capacity, especially as children when this decision is being made. And we think the basic harm principle suggests that if the rest of society is meaningfully affected in a way that we will articulate for you, that interest also should be dominant. The only other thing relevant to this question is whether or not we should let parents make this choice. The question we need to ask ourselves, though, is why do we have parental rights, and why do we think they're significant? The parents' ability to make medical decisions for their children. We think these are fundamentally instrumental goods. We let parents make these choices when they lead to the best outcomes for their parents. To do otherwise would be flawed for 2 reasons. One, it would be subjecting children unfairly to the lottery of birth and to the particular decisions of the parents that they're being born into. And two, because children have no capacity to consent to what their parents are doing to them. Why is it the case that parents can't be allowed to make this choice in this case specifically? Two other reasons. First, because we have a reason to believe their interests could be in conflict with one another in this case. We let parents make choices for their children when their interests align. In this case, we think there's reason why, in some cases at least, those interests might be in conflict for all the traumatic reasons they talk about for what it means to have to be put in this circumstance suddenly and unexpectedly. And second of all, we think the others are harmed and the harms are actually tangible and clear to children when they are affected in this way. So that said, let's talk about the three stakeholders then, because I think we've won under all three grounds anyway, and the way you prioritize them might not even matter. So, children first. So, I want to be very, very clear about this. What are the actual capacities of children that or individuals that we're talking about in this round? So, to have the consciousness of a 6-year-old in the way that we're talking about from opening government does not mean necessarily that you are exactly like a 6-year-old. There's differences. And to be clear, there's also a lot of differentiation among all different kinds of cases here. That you have to be honest and acknowledge that to yourself. But what would we say? We would say that individuals in these circumstances have adult experiences in many circumstances because they still have memories and they still have an ability to conceptualize of themselves. Individuals still have hopes and dreams and desires, just like anyone else. Plenty of 6-year-olds have dreams if you've ever talked to a 6-year-old. At that point, why do we think it is the case that these children deserve some degree of consideration? Even if you buy, though, that it is the case that the children that they're talking about, or even some of the children, are not even of this sort, not able to do the kinds of things that we're articulating for you, the ones who are affected the most by any policy we're choosing here are the ones who do have those hopes and dreams. Those are the ones who most are materially affected by any policy, since they have the largest ability to conceptualize of themselves and what happens to them. At that point, though, why are we better for them? We think we're better for them because it's incredibly infantilizing and dehumanizing to be trapped in the body of a child, even if you have the mind of a child, because you can still understand the fact that you have gone through many life experiences, that you are older. You can still understand the fact that other people in the world are younger than you, and that you are being treated and viewed like one of those people. No matter what the level that you accept is, this effect is true, and that's incredibly pernicious for these people. It is pernicious for these individuals that they can't access many things that you need an adult body to access. These individuals, both sides agree, have desires, and there's plenty of individuals with severe mental handicaps who can enter into relationships with other people and enjoy those relationships that they can't access anymore. You can still have the desire to go outside and play sports to a degree that you wouldn't be able to when you're undergoing these types of procedures. All of these things are tangible impacts that undercut the ability of these individuals to live meaningful lives. The only other thing we get is that you need to protect them from themselves. A few problems with this argument. First, at the time when you're making this choice as an infant, you have no ability to actually understand exactly how the particular way will develop. That's the other thing. Even if there is some degree of variation, I think at the time that a child is born, individuals have vastly different experiences when they have severe mental handicaps, and you don't know exactly which one or how the trajectory of that child's development will actually go at the time when you're making this choice. But additionally, it's not strictly necessary, meaning you should err on the side of doing the least restrictive thing on the child and the least irreversible thing. And finally, we'd say that to some extent, by putting children in a circumstance, if you buy our arguments about feeling dehumanized and feeling worse off, we think it's the case that you should also prioritize making that child's quality of life better. If you buy that they'll be worse off because of this, they're also more likely to engage in things like self-harm. Nick.
Okay, so if you grow past the point of puberty, that is also irreversible. It's irreversible on both sides. Should we just try and deduce what's the best policy for each individual?
Sure. So the reason irreversibility matters in this case is because we think that insofar I think irreversibility only matters in this case because you're exposing someone to a medical risk in order to create this irreversibility when it is not strictly necessary. Third thing I want to talk about is parents, though, and why parents, even if it is about parents, why we still went under the idea of parents. So I think the argument we're going to give you under parents is that even if you accept that their interests should be prioritized, that we have reasons to believe that parents are making a coercive choice that when they choose whether or not to have this procedure done to their children. For all the reasons opening government gave us, we have reasons to believe it is incredibly traumatic when you have a child born with one of these conditions. It is an incredibly jarring thing, an unexpected phenomenon, and something that is difficult to deal with. At that point, what they are defending on their side of the house is individuals who have just undergone an incredibly traumatic experience, making a decision about the irreversible future of a child to have this procedure or not. These are literally the individuals worst positioned to make this decision, we think. Sure.
Probably we won't do it in the first year after the birth, but besides that, don't you think that the possibility that you give your child to adoption is way higher and that the life of this child will then be way worse? Why don't you think that even if it's just the interest of the parents, it might matter for the child?
So things like adoption don't need to be necessarily bad. In fact, what we would say is they're much more likely to be better on our side of the house, number one. And number two, we think you open yourself to a new degree of challenges. If your child has a complete inability to conceptualize themselves and feels dehumanized, they're also more likely to be worse off and cause the same kind of impacts. The final reason we think this choice is coercive, though, is because it's incredibly difficult to assess at the time what would actually make you as a parent better off. You have no ability to understand what it's like to live with a grown child with this condition. At that point, you shouldn't subject her to this medical procedure when you don't actually know what's actually better for you. Finally, I want to talk about society and explain why this matters. Look, in a world in which these procedures are used widely, there are two possibilities. It's either used widely, in which case a societal perception of these individuals is consistently the case that they're infantilized, and you create policies and undermine funding for things that actually allow these individuals to access the world for themselves. Or it is not used widely, in which case it is the wealthy who are able to access this disproportionately. That's problematic because these are the very individuals who give you the greatest possibility of advocating for change, for funding for the well-being of these individuals, for funding for things like adoption agencies, for funding for things like welfare services for these individuals. In either case, no matter whether it's done widely or not, you have a major problem in terms of your ability to meaningfully fund these things and meaningfully actually create programs that make the lives of all future children who are born with this condition better off. Their interests are important, and for those reasons, we're proud to propose.
Okay, I think I'm going to his address, and I invite the government extension speaker forward.
Good to hear.
Madam Speaker, to impose the will of a government that cannot and will never understand what these children are going through, we think is fundamentally unethical. I want to begin by talking about two areas of clash, and specifically mentioning one area where there was no clash, because there shouldn't be any clash. This debate wasn't about parents' rights to do things to their children that would be bad. The argument made on the government bench was quite clear. By making the parents happier and better able to take care of their children, the children are made better off. Making it easier for parents to take care of their children doesn't make the parents happier. It's the parents' happiness that we're evaluating in this round. It makes it much more likely that they will actually take care of their children rather than sending them off to some facility or neglecting them, which we think is a really problematic issue. What we get on our side of the house is better lives for children and a better society more broadly. The two areas of the debate that matter, and I'm going to go through my extension under each of these areas when we get there. Firstly, though, I want to talk about what's best for these children. Because I think the problem on their side of the house, and this will be clear throughout this entire argument, is that this question for them is dependent upon them winning the second point. In order for it to be the case that children can have a meaningfully good life on their side of the house without access to this treatment, there have to be good facilities for them, a great deal of social support and political support for these policies. Because they cannot just fiat in their society that there are going to be wonderful treatment facilities for anyone with any mental disability. The political will for this doesn't exist in the status quo, doesn't exist in plenty of societies where this treatment isn't permitted, and that will not change whether or not this actually is true. So we'll get to that issue when we discuss socialization. But in a world where there isn't enough political will to get these people the treatment that they need, we think it's quite clear what's better for children. Why? Because while they say that they understand that the issue is nuanced, they ask POIs like, would you require it for everyone? It is quite clear they don't understand that the people who probably know best in any individual case whether or not the children will be made better or worse off by this treatment are the parents, not the government requiring it or banning it for everyone. Some children might be able to get jobs. Some children might not be able to get jobs. It is silly to require it or to ban it when the people who will know best and best be able to evaluate this question are the people who have the exact same interests in mind. They say no. The parents have a perverse incentive because they think that parents are some sort of rational actor who cares about the exact cost and will suddenly stop being able to decide whether or not a treatment is best for their children because there's some marginal cost of doing so. We think that this characterization is ridiculous, especially when they talk about political elites as well. But before we go on to that point, I'll take your POI.
If a parent believed that it would make care better or make them more likely to keep their child or have any of the facts that you're talking about, would you allow that parent to make a child more mentally handicapped?
What? I'm very confused. If it actually was the case that the children would be better off being mentally handicapped, I think it's absurd to even conceptualize that question. But I think what we know in this particular circumstance is that we actually realize that it is the case that parents would be better off in this way. I also just think part of the issue is to say that it would be a handicap in some sense. You have a body that is similar to your mind is also part of the issue that they have on their side of the house. It's not so awful to be a 6-year-old. We were all 6-year-olds and it wasn't so awful. I think what they don't understand is that the idea that when they make the arguments about infantilization and dehumanization that they're not referring to the real issue at stake. They're not infantilized because they have 6-year-old bodies. Everyone who has these mental disabilities is infantilized in this society because of the way that their minds operate and the way that we perceive those minds. And I think that that is the issue for them on their side of the house. What they also don't understand is just because it's irreversible because there is risk involved is also ridiculous. There's risk involved when you go through puberty without understanding what the process is like of emotional trauma, when you don't understand what it means or can't understand what it means, when you, for example, have your first period or start growing breasts. And I don't think they understand on their side of the house, maybe because I'm one of these sisters, how problematic that might be if you actually didn't have the mental capacity to deal with those issues. Sorry guys, I was going to make some fun of you. And I'm not going to make fun of you too much for not understanding that cerebral palsy is a physical disability and not a mental one. So I think that the issue that they have on their side of the house with understanding what is best for children is that they don't understand what's best for children, nor do they understand that the people who truly do know what's best are the precise parents involved in these circumstances. The only argument that they make on this level that we think is even marginally persuasive, essentially, is that the parents might in some circumstances not be the best educated or best capable of making this decision. There's an easy solution for this. It's called doctors. We have them in our society. They inform parents. They talk to parents. They explain to them exactly what the medical information is there. And I think that when we have parents making informed medical decisions, which is precisely what we get on our side of the house, we have no concerns about the parents actually doing something that is not in their children's best interest. But even if we do, we think the important question is a comparative one. Who is more likely to make a better choice for these children, the parents or the children? I'll take closing, actually.
Okay, so if parents are so much better situated to make these decisions themselves, why are you then also saying that doctors should be the ones who are making the ultimate decision?
Doctors aren't making the ultimate decision. That's not what happens in any society. There's no paternalistic doctors refusing to treat patients because they don't feel like it. It's not medical paternalism, it's informed consent. So the next thing that we talk about is why it's better for society. I think they rest a lot of their hat on this argument that political elites are all of a sudden going to abandon the issue of disability rights when they can have their children getting this treatment as opposed to being treated in the facility. I think this is utterly ridiculous. The people who are going to have the most sympathy for individuals and disability rights advocates are precisely these parents who have this concern. They're not almost going to just stop caring about their children or other people in a society who have disabilities because they can escape the problem their way. What we think is also the case is that this isn't an escape that parents would choose if it was the case that we lived in some sort of ideal, perfect society where everyone with disabilities was treated as an equal citizen and had equal rights. I don't think this is really the problem that we have. We live in an imperfect world where these people are not treated fairly and not treated equally, and we think that what these parents will realize when they feel the pressure to perform this treatment is exactly the ways in which the world could be improved. They will lobby, they will promote for these things, but it's also just not the case that there's so many parents, and this is going to be the meaningful tipping point. The real meaningful tipping point, and the extension of this point that I would really like to bring to your attention, is why we get better socialization of our society regarding these people, and why it's the case that we actually get better treatment of them more broadly, from not just the parents, but from the society writ large. Why do we think this is the case? Because what happens to children who don't get these treatments, essentially, is that they are often put in facilities for most of their adult lives, because they're incapable for their parents to take care of them, because of the severe burdens that we talk about. What that means is that while they're in facilities, the rest of our society doesn't interact with them, doesn't engage with them. What changes on our side of the house is that parents will often bring these children with them into the world the same way that we do with all of the other children that we have, and introduce them to other people, engage with them socially. We don't think this is a simple sort of exposure effect or sort of exposure effect. We think it's greater than that because they will actually engage with these people and see them. What their argument is they will see them as infants. But I think our point is quite clear. Even if they see them as children, that's better than seeing them as a non-human other, which is how we think they're often treated in our society. Engaging with these people, seeing them perhaps for the developmental challenges that they have, is actually a much better system that we get on our side of the house. And in the long term, that kind of socialization, when they see that these people are like them in many ways, and how they can be made better off in our society by engaging with systems, the idealistic systems that we think would exist on both sides of the house, but are more likely to exist on ours, I think makes it quite clear why this has particular political benefits. Look, at the end of the day, what's better for children in both societies is having a better systemic treatment of these individuals. We get that on our side of the house. But in an imperfect world, where these treatments and facilities don't exist, it is much better to allow parents to make this choice for their children, because it will make them better off, and we think for that reason, it's quite clear how this round falls.
I think the member can address, and then Victoria is the opposition extension.
Madam Speaker, in high school I had the privilege of being part of organizing the Special Olympics at my school and participating in watching athletes who had similar mental differently abled conditions and looking at the life that they all the lives that they shared, being part of a community. You understand that even people that might have diminished capacity, that's not like our own mental capacities, have robust and complex lives. They interact with other people, that rely on an adult conception of themselves, and even awareness of their own mental differences. I think that these are things that they can still meaningfully engage with, and people still have some self-reflective capacity that's hugely important. So what we're going to bring you specifically in our extension is going to talk a little bit more about the psychological harms that I think we're more gestured at, as well as bring you some more development arguments about how this actually affects the ongoing well-being mentally of these individuals. And then we're also going to talk to you a little bit about how we think this becomes ultimately a coerced choice for parents as well, in the way that this actually manifests in society and our healthcare practices. First, a couple of pieces of specific rebuttal from what we just heard from Zach. So I actually do want to highlight what I think was a good POI out of the top half of opposition, because I think it rests a lot with a lot of what our argumentation would talk about. Because they talk about, would you mentally handicap if it was better for a particular adult? So this is actually something we did. There were several hundreds of years where people that showed severe mental illness, things like being bipolar, being depressed, showed an ability to cause harm to themselves or others, were basically subjected to generations of ice pick lobotomies. That we said, if you're going to be less violent, less of a harm to society, we should just diminish your mental capacity so that you don't do that. We don't do that because we recognize that people ought to have individual rights and they ought not be preemptively punished for something that often doesn't even mean that those people are going to harm others, and that there are less restrictive ways than fundamentally altering someone's ability to meaningfully engage with their particular circumstances. I think this is hugely problematic, and I think they need to tell us why we should say that the physical form is less important than the mental form just because we have different experiences of how we interact with our physical capacities versus our mental capacities, especially recognizing that for those with diminished mental capacity, your physical capacity becomes all that more important. The same way a blind individual might rely on other senses that are more central because they don't have the access to sight, and so their hearing becomes much more vital to them because that's the way they experience the world. The next thing that we hear is this idea that well, everyone's infantilized, regardless of their physical being when they have a mental difference. So I don't think that this is actually necessarily true, and it's a difference in kind. That yes, we might have a problem socially with treating people who are mentally differently abled with a different level of understanding of their full adultness. But I think that we simply talk to children differently. I think that we do interact with mentally different people within our society, that they often are put through really excellent programs that place them in jobs that are actually within their mental capacities, often in movie theaters, people taking your tickets. And I speak very differently to an adult man who's working in that job, and the fact that he can even hold that job by virtue of presenting himself as an adult man, than I would a child. So recognize, especially when you're talking about the difference between a disabled child and a disabled adult, and then often people are thoughtful and just want to treat disabled people in the most normal way possible, so you treat them like you would their age, and people recognize this. This is conversations I had with mentally handicapped competitors who can tell when people are talking to them like they're retarded, and recognize how that feels, and then recognize that it completely alienates them. You also know what it means to be talked to like a child, and that's hugely harmful, especially when you have no control over that, because you can't correct people because they just always see you that way. The last thing they say, look, a lot of the problem is they end up being put in facilities, and this is far worse. So I don't think that the answer is we should just sedate people until they comply to our ideas of how you should interact in society. I think often a lot of these facilities also are they're talking about more this is actually quite common in a good way, and I think it's actually a good argument for us that often parents don't raise their children for their entire lives when they have these instances, because there's really good things like halfway homes where people can live in assisted living, and they have communities with one another that are actually sculpted to the particular needs of that society. I don't think we sedate people and just handicap them into being able to live with our society, give them a place where they can flourish, and that's where they have those better interactions. Okay, moving on to constructive. First thing I want to talk about is psychological harm. First thing I want to talk about under this that we didn't get any engagement from the top half with is an understanding of how cognitive development functions within this. So I think that insofar as we tell you that often, because this means that people do treat people that they see as children as differently, your entire world of interaction with people and your lived experience of the world and your ability to develop is stunted in a particular way. But recognize that just because you are mentally differently able doesn't mean you can't have a magnitude of how that affects your life based on treatments. Yes, we cannot cannot cure these things, but there are behavioral things that make it so your life is worse or better. And I think that recognizing that often the families and the societies, they go to the greatest lengths to treat them as normal, letting them have jobs, giving agency, giving them an understanding of their adult autonomy. Those individuals thrive under those conditions because we all feel good to have control over our life, and we all feel good over that regardless. So I think that they actually end up diminishing your long-term cognitive ability and worsening the mental handicap that these individuals might suffer from by virtue of the fact that they limit them in this way. But we tell you, secondly, that this creates an enormous amount of alienation that even children feel when they're different from another individual. And that often, these are even people that have either friendships with other differently abled people or with people who are like neurotypical. And I think that insofar as this is true, and you watch your friends change and you do not experience puberty, you watch movies where you understand that people have sexual desires that you do not and ought to be able to have, those sorts of things. That alienation is what leads to things like outbursts, self-harm, depression, things that are all extremely high rates and common among these individuals. So I think that while like maybe some people just like get testosterone and feel more aggressive, and I think there are actually alternative ways to deal with that, right? That you can have other sorts of hormone treatments that don't stunt you physically, but still are something that allow people who are like truly threats to other people. There's like a less restrictive way, and we would try to avoid that as much as possible. But I think that that's preferable, sure.
When I was 6 years old, I felt actually pretty fine with not knowing about sex and not having this desire. What makes you so sure that the standards you have and you assume everybody has is true for those people as well? Why are you so sure about it just because you talk to one?
I think that like lots of kids feel when they are different from someone else, when they're like bullied, when they're alienated. I just think that like it might be an appeal to intuition, but that was my lived experience of it. I'm glad you were such a happy, blissful 6-year-old. Most people aren't. But we tell you, so I think that next I'd also say that like this allows for some understanding of like a sexual identity, that even if you don't have a full capacity to consent, the ability to like have sexual feeling and sexual pleasure is something that I think is a commonality experience. It's something that gives people like meaning and things that they like about their life. But the last thing I want to talk about is how this becomes a coerced choice for parents as well. Because they want to make the best decision, but they don't have future knowledge what it's going to be for their child, nor the medical expertise to say what that is. So I think often doctors are going to be the ones who urge that yes, you should do this, it could be really hard, it's going to be really scary. And off of the basis of fear and deferment to authority, this means a lot of people end up making this decision, even though it might not have been what was actually going to be best for them. But then I think furthermore, it also means that people target insurance around it, because one-time procedure versus lifetime of care, different incentive of how much it costs, which means that we also structure society, treatment facilities, and what access you get around what is the easiest and what we think is simplest. All these reasons are practical facts.
I thank the member for her address, and I invite the government whip to close out the government bench.
So I'm going to make an argument that might seem counterintuitive if you've listened to Op Bench, but it's really simple and actually really obvious. People with disabilities can have different needs and different circumstances, even when they have the same disability. What Zach and I are defending on our side of the house is that we should let parents make decisions, because not everyone has the same experience growing up. Not everyone is in a community and can access the communities that they're talking about. So guess what? There will be some parents that elect not to have this procedure done, and people can go into group homes. People can get jobs. Zach and I are saying that there are some instances in which that's not possible, but here's another novel idea. We think that we should break down the barrier and stigma surrounding the physical body. That's our entire point. The only reason why we have all of this bad psychological stigma that they're talking about on their side of the house is because we get less socialization on their side of the house. That's what they needed to respond to, and that was the meat of our extension. So the first thing I want to talk about is who makes the best decisions, or which party makes the best decisions for these children. Second thing, which is better for the individuals themselves. And third, which is better for society writ large. So let's talk about who makes the best decisions. We get this argument out of second opposition that this is going to become a coerced choice, because parents are just going to be like, well, it might be hard, therefore I'm just going to do it. So I know we're debaters, we're all hyper-rational, but there's this thing called emotion, and sometimes parents have them for their children. This is not an easy decision for parents to do. I think that all of the arguments that they're talking about are probably risks that the doctor would tell the parent before they make that decision, and not every parent is going to come to the same conclusion. Like, I could have had a bunch of orthopedic surgeries to make me marginally physically better, and my mom was like, maybe you shouldn't spend your summers doing that. Like, there are different ways in which you can deal with disability, and different parents can have different conceptions, and guess what? They are the ones who have the best information, not the state. And because they have the best information, they're able to make that decision, we think, in a better way. We don't think it's a coerced choice, given all that goes into getting a procedure like this. But then we get this argument, which is like, would you, apparently the good POI, which is like, would you make someone more mentally disabled if it meant that it was like better off, if it meant that they were like objectively better off? So, no, the question is, what is best for the child from the perspective of the child as well? So that's the entire debate. So I'm going to talk about now why it's actually not best for the child, not from like an objective societal sense, but also from the perspective of the child, which I don't think we've gotten a lot of argumentation about. So first of all, we think we get better care on our side of the house. People with mental disabilities are uniquely situated because they are dependent upon others to interact with other people in society, but also to receive care, to receive a good living. On our side of the house, we get better parents because it is simply a little bit easier in some circumstances to care for the child. Our argument was very simple. Raising children is hard. Raising a child with a mental disability is just a fact. It's hard. When you have parents who are more exhausted, when you have parents who are having to put in more work, there's things like resentment that occur. Parents become less willing and less able to take their children out in society, to take their adult children out in society, to interact with other people. That's what creates the bad treatment. That's what creates the social stigma. Because when you are not interacting with people in society, when people in society are not interacting with people with disabilities, then you get all of the misconceptions that we heard down the entire op bench. Go for it.
Are you more likely to get all of the socialization benefits that you talk about when you can get a job because you look like you're 22 and you have the body of a 22-year-old, or when you don't?
What we're saying is we want a society where someone doesn't say to somebody else, you can't have a job because you look 22. That's the social stigma we're trying to solve on our side of the house, and that's what they haven't critically engaged in. Look, not everyone also just gonna have like the body of a 6-year-old. I don't know why we're like so obsessed with 6-year-olds. And they said like the mental capabilities of a 6-year-old, puberty happens at like 12 or 13, which is like different than 6, so I don't think the body just stops at 6. That was really bizarre. But it actually does make a meaningful difference, right? Like, you can actually like be like work at a grocery store if you have the body of a 12 or 13-year-old. You can get a job if you have the body of a 12 or 13-year-old. What Zach and I want to defend is a long-term vision that creates a better society. People, when they interact with other people, learn about them. So they learn what disabilities mean what things. Actually, like, they learn like the fact that there are some, they learn and guess what? Like all the things about being talked down to, etc. Those barriers are broken down through interaction. So I think that's the argument they missed. But here's the other thing. We think that all the psychological harms that they talked about on their side of the house, especially this is the extension that we got from closing op, was that like people are going to have psychological harms because there's just like this physical thing that you know you know that you're not growing up at the same rate. I think one of the biggest reasons why you have psychological harm, and I will in a little bit, I think one of the biggest reasons why you have psychological harms in a little bit. I think one of the big reasons why you have psychological harms is because of things like isolation, right? Because you're not able to interact with society. So they're automatically assuming, right, that these people have access to a wide group of friends that they're seeing growing up. The hard reality is that's not the case, because guess what? Not all parents, one, have the capability to spend this extra time, especially when they have increased physical tolls, but two, are able to integrate their children into these communities. That becomes easier when we reduce the physical toll, which is the argument that we were making. Sure, which one did I take first? I already took it. Go ahead.
Okay, so since there's going to be less people entering these communities, period, are we going to say that the people who aren't doing this procedure are going to have increased isolation, lack of resources, and lack of communities for these individuals?
No, because here's the thing. I think that in the future, when you break down these social stigmas surrounding mental disability, then it makes it easier to have, it makes it easier for people of both varieties to interact with society. That's why we get the societal benefits. Because here's the thing. And this is like the societal point that I'm going to talk about, or that I'm talking about now. Here's the thing. People like treat disability as like this monolithic entity, like you have a disability or you don't, and they tend to like talk down to you regardless of your disability, right? So I think that we actually get is when you have more interaction with people with disabilities writ large, when we have like more people going out, when we have parents that are better able to physically bring their children and interact with other people, there's actually spillover benefits because people learn more about disability as a concept. People learn more about disabilities in general. And yes, we agree You can perceive when someone is talking down to you. Here's the reality. When someone has mental retardation and is 22, people still talk down to them. That's the reality in the world today. It's not because you have an adult body that people magically treat you better. The problem is they don't understand the disability itself. When you have more interaction, there's a greater likelihood that you understand the disability itself. So at the end of the day, that's the argument that they miss. Yes, there are a lot of problems in the status quo. There's a lot of stigma in the status quo. That's all because we can't have a policy like this where we facilitate more social interaction. We envision a better society for people with disabilities in the future. We're very proud to propose.
I thank the member for his address, and I invite the opposition speaker to close up the last round of the round robin.
Madam Speaker, members of the panel, I think what they had to establish on their side of the House in order to paint a compelling picture of socialization actually changing the way that we think about disabled people is connecting the dots for us and showing how that socialization would actually take place. Because when you have people who have, when you have these individuals still in children's bodies, it means that they can't do the things that would dispel our myths about their limited capacities. It means that you can't have them working a part-time job at a movie theater or at a supermarket, or you can't have them play, like participating in the Special Olympics, or even playing like basketball with other people their age and dispelling those types of, because the way that you dispel those myths is showing that they have an additional level of agency. When you, that's linked to their physicality. When you remove that level of agency linked to that physicality, you like even if there are more of those people around you, they're just like these people that you perceive as children that you don't perceive as like people with limited needs, and so it doesn't get you don't get any of those benefits from second government. Okay, 2 questions I want to talk about. First of all, when will this procedure be used?
Check on that.
And second of all, what are the impacts on children's welfare? So first, government tells you that parents can advance their own can advance their own interests, and so that's one reason that the procedure should be used. First opposition tells you that these individuals are bad judges of their own future experience, and that's especially true in light of the trauma of an unexpected the unexpected event of finding out that you have now a massively complicated life where you're going to be caring for this child with all of these additional frustrations and risks to maybe your own marriage or your own welfare. We think that what that means is that people are abundantly going to be risk averse in these decisions. But then they tell you, and so there is a conflict of interest in many cases. But then they tell you that parents are best situated, so even if they're not acting in their own interests, that they're doing so on the behalf of these individuals. So first opposition, first of all, tells you that it would be very difficult for parents to suss out whether it would be the correct decision or not, because because there are such diverse paths of development for people with any given disease. By the way, conceded by second government. And I think that makes it abundantly hard to predict. Even if you have even if you have doctors making these decisions, if there are different paths of development, it's hard for doctors to even get that level of informed consent that Zach tells you about. And I think that's really important because what that means is that ultimately what doctors and parents are likely to do is overplay our natural risk aversion and say that we are going to defer to trying to prevent these types of burdens on parents. That parents are going to be facing all of the negatives of these the negative potentialities for them personally, and feel as if they should make this decision in order to make the procedure happen. So that's really important because while there might be some people that are coerced, most people will feel as if they're going to weight their individual, their own interests more strongly, and that they're going to say that there's a role for me, for my self-interest as well. Which means that when more and more people are making these decisions in favor of physical disability, it means that it becomes normalized. So that it becomes question begging and more difficult to justify if you say to yourself that you actually want to go ahead and take on the risks of having a child who could potentially harm themselves and who could potentially cause so much more difficulty for you. So what that means is that it feels incumbent on parents to defer to making these decisions in favor of disability. Which means that most decisions will not actually be in favor of the type of socialization, even if they could prove that argument. Okay, sure.
Very often you say in some cases it's the best idea to even do it. You're saying in some cases, in most cases it's not, but in some cases it is. You are banning it for everyone. We are saying let's make an entity an informed decision, and then depending on the degree and then depending on the special circumstances, let us choose. You are saying it's wrong always. Why? How can you defend
Okay.
that?
Given the possible divergences within any sort of path of development, it is going to be rational for any parent to say that I want to avert the worst case scenario. I want to avert the horrific things that could happen to me, that could happen to my marriage, that could happen to this child if they do become like a fully grown adult and are able to inflict harm on other people. That means that they are going to defer to that, and that you're going to get that strengthened by having the medical profession put a seal on that type of risk aversion, which means that those decisions become more prevalent, and you don't have that decision made as often. So in that case, I think it ultimately amounts to the same thing where most people are making that decision. Okay, so the second thing I want to look at then is the impacts on children's welfare. So second government tells you that the infantilization on either side of the house is equally bad. We think that it's not that there is an additional level of oppression that these individuals feel, where they're not able to actually articulate the feelings that they may have. They want to participate in other activities, like they want to have a job, like they see other people their age able to do, but they're not able to do that. And they may not. I think that's made much worse by the fact that they can't express that to their parents, that they can't express that to other people, and that it is fundamentally irreversible. They tell you that there's going to be socialization benefits. I think I've already addressed this in my overview, that ultimately the only way that you have socialization that destigmatizes these individuals is when they can take part in those activities on the same level as other people and dispel those types of misconceptions.
On that.
Sure.
Okay. Your solution to socialization is by people with mental disabilities proving their physical worth. A lot of people with mental disabilities also have physical disabilities. Isn't conversation the better catch-all solution to socialization?
You're not even going to be having those avenues to conversation because it's not clear that those individuals, you're always, when you have conversation alone and not have common activities with them, it's easy for people to just shape that into a lens already where they say that these people have less ability and should be treated as unequal. When you can actually see that they are capable of doing other things that you are capable of, it is easier for people to actually have a heuristic where they see those people as equally deserving of respect and rights and equal treatment. So the final thing I want to talk about then, under this point, is the impact on individuals' welfare. Because when they feel their own agency in their ability to act on desires, on our side of the house, they're able to do things like participate in the Special Olympics. But when you're not able to do that on their side of the house, and you have people unable to act on the physical abilities that they see other people of their age that they were friends with growing up now able to do those things, it's much more likely that they have these feelings of repressed agency, which means that they can and are more likely to engage in the types of harmful behavior that first government talks about. Especially if we're going to say that they have the bodies of an 11 or 12-year-old, it's very likely that they have the capacity to inflict that pain on themselves. So for all of these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.